The president is taking aim at his 2020 challengers this weekend. At a rally in Green Bay, Wisconsin Saturday, the president made several false claims and called Democrats, quote, radical. He singled out possible frontrunners like former Vice President Joe Biden and Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
Sleepy Joe, Crazy Bernie. You look at the candidates, right? I think Pocahontas, she's finished, she's out. But can you imagine any of these people up here doing what I'm doing? There'd be 200 people show up if they were president. If they weren't president, nobody would show up. Is that right?
A new poll shows former Vice President Joe Biden at the top of a crowded field after he announced his candidacy on Thursday. But the primary race is still close, with over 9 months until the first votes are cast. Mark Landler is a White House correspondent for the New York Times and joins us now from our Washington bureau. Mark, thanks very much for joining us. The president had more to say about the 2020 race after his rally. On Twitter late Saturday, he said the Democratic National Committee was rigging the nomination against Senator Bernie Sanders. What is this strategy by the president here? Is his criticism more about the candidate or about the Democratic Party?
I think, Elaine, his criticism is somewhat about the candidate he'd most like to face off against. He, in the last election, made a big point of trying to drive a wedge between Bernie supporters and the Democratic Party, I think with some success, and he'd like to repeat that formula this time around. It's to his benefit, A, to divide the Democratic Party, but I think also to give as much lift as he can to Bernie Sanders and his candidacy for the simple reason that I think he believes Bernie Sanders is the easiest candidate for him to beat in 2020.
Well, Sanders is another contender in this race who has both the name recognition and a presidential campaign under his belt. Does Biden's entrance steal any of Sanders' thunder?
Well, it was widely expected that Joe Biden would enter this race, and for the moment, it turns it very much into a two-man race. Interestingly, a two-man race between men who are in their mid to late 70s, so it raises questions about the generational appeal of either candidate. But I think, look, it's extremely early days, and it's very hard to see whether one or both of them are going to continue to be front runners as we get closer to the actual primaries. I think there will be a great deal of shaking out over the summer and the fall, and it'll be interesting to see whether Joe Biden remains a front runner or whether his front runner status at the moment is largely a function of having very high name recognition.
What about, Mark, the fact that you have Joe Biden and Senator Sanders, both men who happen to be white? How, in fact, does that impact this conversation that's taking place, particularly in the Democratic Party, about the notion of electability in the general election?
Well, I think, you raise a good point, and their age is yet another factor that plays into it. These are two gentlemen who don't look very much like the base of the party that they currently represent. This is a party that's very diverse, it's younger, and it's, at the moment, very driven by progressive ideas and a very progressive approach, progressive policy stance. Bernie certainly fits that side of the equation. Vice President Biden really doesn't. So I think that Democrats will face a very fundamental question as they get closer to the nomination, which is, do they want to nominate someone who galvanizes the base, who appeals to progressive ideals, who might lead to a bigger turnout, or do they want to nominate someone they believe has the best chance of actually beating President Trump in a general election? Joe Biden's candidacy is going to be very much framed around the idea of him being the most electable, him having the best chance to beat the sitting president. Democrats historically tend to not go in that direction. They often tend to vote their hearts more than their heads. It'll be interesting to see what wins this time around.
Well, another person vying for a different kind of nomination is Stephen Moore, the president's pick for the Federal Reserve. Moore is under scrutiny for comments he made that were widely considered disparaging to women. Mark, I know you've reported on this. How is President Trump's endorsement shaping this nomination process?
Well, President Trump tends, whether by instinct or deliberately, to choose people for jobs that sometimes look a lot like him. And Stephen Moore is an interesting case in point. He's got this history of politically incorrect statements about women and other issues. He also has had a messy divorce with a failure to pay alimony and child support to an ex-wife. So in some ways, President Trump can see a bit of himself in Stephen Moore. And like President Trump, Stephen Moore's response to all of these unflattering things being unearthed about him is to double down, to be very defiant, to say, look, this is an attack on my character. President Trump admires that kind of defiance because that's very much the way he lives his own life. He was very defiant about the charges raised about him after the release of the Access Hollywood tape and other allegations of sexual harassment over the years. So you do see this pattern that President Trump tends often to nominate people that he admires and that are a bit like him. Stephen Moore has now said, look, if I become a big distraction for the president, I'm going to pull my name out. And so we'll see whether Stephen Moore really is formally nominated, whether the president wants to pick this fight. The question here is not whether President Trump might back someone like Moore. We know he might, but in the face of so many other agenda items that the president has, does he want to have a huge fight over a Fed nominee? We'll have to wait and see.
So meanwhile, the Attorney General is scheduled to appear before Congress this week, Mark, to answer questions about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report. However, the Justice Department reportedly said Sunday that William Barr might not attend. Do we know what's in dispute here?
Well, what's in dispute is the format of the testimony. The chairman, Gerald Landler, has proposed having members of the committee pose questions, but then having an extended session afterward where committee counsel, where the lawyers for the members would actually also get to question the Attorney General. And the Justice Department, the Attorney General, appear to be balking at that arrangement. I mean, it's sort of interesting given Bill Barr's commitment to not only release the Mueller report, but to go up to Capitol Hill and answer any and all questions about that report. It's sort of interesting that he's now beginning to draw lines around that and say, well, look, I'm willing to do one set of questions, but I'm not willing to be questioned by lawyers. And for a guy who's been Attorney General under 2 presidents and is arguably one of the most senior government lawyers that we have in this country, it's a bit of a surprise that he is worried about being questioned by lawyers.
I want to turn to foreign policy, and as I do, I want to bring in a little bit of breaking news here that we're just getting the details of now, Mark, the passing of former Indiana Senator Richard Lugar. If you could just share with us a little bit about his legacy when it comes to foreign policy in particular, because for people who may not be familiar, he was the kind of Republican that was very much a bipartisan figure that sought to reach across the aisle on these foreign policy matters in a way that, frankly, we haven't really seen in more recent years.
Yeah, that's right. Dick Lugar, it's fair to say, is a sort of a vanishing species in Washington. There used to be quite a few senators like him who were, conservative and staunchly Republican on a variety of issues, but on foreign policy reached across the aisle and kind of established the idea that politics stops at the water's edge. Dick Lugar was extremely important in some areas, notably helping the post-Soviet Union. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he played a big role in trying to secure nuclear weapons in some of the former Soviet states. He traveled extensively as a senator. Interestingly, one of the trips that he brought along a young Democratic senator named Barack Obama, and President Obama wrote and talked a lot in years afterwards about how important that trip was, how much he learned from Senator Lugar. And in fact, that relationship continued when the president, advanced to the White House, and it ended up hurting Senator Lugar. Senator Lugar was challenged in a Republican primary when he ran for a 7th term and actually lost. in part because of the criticism of Republicans that he was too open to Democrats, that he was too bipartisan. And so, it really previewed this much more partisan environment that we have in Washington today. So it really is the passing of a giant figure in foreign policy and a giant figure in the U.S. Senate.
And we're getting the news release as well from the Lugar Center. I'll read just a bit of it, that Senator Richard Lugar, 87, who served as mayor of Indianapolis from 1968 to 1975, a U.S. Senator from 1977 to 2013, and president of the Lugar Center since 2013, died peacefully on Sunday, April 28th at 1:44 a.m. at the Inova Fairfax Heart and Vascular Institute in Virginia. As we think about this and looking ahead to foreign policy, Mark, is there another voice perhaps on the horizon similar to Dick Lugar's that you can see based on your experience there covering Washington?
Well, there are senators, Republican senators and Democrats, who've carved out a kind of a franchise in foreign policy. You see it a bit with Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. You see it also with Marco Rubio of Florida on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, Chris Coons of Delaware has become an important voice on foreign policy. I think the hard part for all of these senators is rising above the partisan nature of the institution and of the city today. Lindsey Graham is a very good example of this. He has parted company with President Trump on certain issues, withdrawing troops from Syria being a very prominent example. But I think as Lindsey Graham has become such an ally of President Trump in other areas, he finds it harder and harder to play that sort of bipartisan role in foreign policy. So really, I don't think there's a true analogy for what Dick Lugar represented, at least in the moment we live in now, the Washington of today. There's just not space for that kind of figure.
All right, Mark Landler joining us there from our Washington bureau. Mark, I understand as well, congratulations are in order. Your new assignment, you'll be off to London as the New York Times bureau chief there. Congratulations.
Thank you, Elaine. I appreciate that.